All right, so we're gonna get going back to the program. So the next couple speakers we have are going to be talking about peri-urban and rural communities. So first up, we have AJ Carrillo with Cedar Springs Farm. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. Just take a moment, just take a deep breath all together. There we go. Welcome. My name is AJ Carrillo. I'm actually not with Cedar Springs Farm. My good friend Jake Tackett was unable to be here today because his wife is very, very pregnant. So he is on house arrest. So I came in to pinch hit. But my name is AJ Carrillo. I've been in regenerative agriculture for the past 10 years. Recently have taken an agricultural sabbatical to pivot my career into urban resilience and sustainability, which I'm studying at CU Boulder right now in the Masters of the Environment program. I'm working with CPHE and DOLA to create a framework of recommendations to address extreme heat in Colorado right now. But my passion is agroforestry, systems, permaculture, and regenerating as much of the ecosystem as quickly as possible. So I'm interested in scalable, efficient, effective solutions for addressing the climate crisis with nature-based solutions. Capiche? Here we go. All right. So agroforestry in the Southwest. This is my buddy Jake, who's from Cedar Springs Farm. This is Cedar Springs Farm. So right out the gate, we're going to notice there's some earthworks, managing the water on the landscape to help slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in at the roots of trees. So that's where we're going to be talking a lot about today. Where are they located? They're in Hotchkiss, Colorado. So one of the case studies that we'll be addressing today. So want to make sure that I have my timer with me because I tend to get long-winded. So make sure we stay on task and topics.
This is what the Bible talks about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, AJ.
That's good. No, appreciate it. I did my best. I touched a button.
I think I might get.
Turn it off. Well, just getting the sound, everybody smile, I'm gonna get a couple pictures. Trees, trees, trees.
My daughter goes around holding the camera like this. She goes, say cheese. She doesn't push the button or nothing. Are we up and running? Can y'all hear me online there? I can hear me. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you. But we need you to stay close to that microphone or clip the microphone on you because every time you walk around and turn away from it, it gets a little bit dicey. So if you want to clip that microphone onto your shirt, it would help.
Heard that. Thank you. All right. So there we go. Okay, so that is what agroforestry, that's what agroforestry is. This is now not working on my advance. Well, we're getting there, everybody. We're gonna get there any minute now. Any minute. The advance is not working with the Schmidrick here.
Oh, it's because of this.
Okay, there we go. I got it.
I gotta stop that.
Okay, so
It's just like everything. I know. That's why the volume's down and it's muted.
great. Okay, here we go. Carrying right along. So, so that's what agroforestry is. It's using trees to create the triple bottom line to help us achieve our short-term, long-term goals in alignment with our core values. This is fundamentally TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. We have been managing as human beings ecosystems since time immemorial. We're just remembering those things because it's important to remember that we are managing complex ecosystems. What is a complex system? This is a complicated system, all right? There's a chain of events that happens. You push button and it goes. If it doesn't go, something's broken. We fix it, it works. Complex systems are integrated, interdependent, interrelated. And the rule is cascading unintended consequences. That's the rule of complex systems, a living emergent systems. That's what we're dealing with. We're managing systems that do things that we cannot expect. So they express emergent properties, and that's the rule. Cascading unintended consequences. We, however, as managers, have an opportunity to decide, or at least set it up to be beneficial consequences in alignment with our goals, or negative consequences. So again, we're at TEK, 5 agroforestry practices: alley cropping, silvopasture, forest farming, windbreaks, riparian buffer zones. Those are patterns. Those are patterns of events. Those are patterns of actions. They are not dogmatic. It's not one thing. This is a flexible pattern or framework of action. Again, why agroforestry? Because we're dealing with a global climate crisis, which is existing in the ecosystem, the complex system that we're all a part of. And we need to increase resilience ASAP. So how are we going to increase resilience? We might want to look at the ecosystems that have been surviving here on planet Earth for the past 6 ice ages. That sounds like climate resilience to me. So let's mimic those natural systems. And those natural systems create ecosystem services. Some examples, just a couple, of ecosystem services are air and water purification, carbon sequestration, think aquifer refilling for water, erosion control, flood mitigation, drought tolerance, resource production, food, feed, fuel, fiber, medicine, materials, the things we need to survive and thrive now and into the future, wildlife corridors, pollinator pathways, extreme heat mitigation, and climate stabilization. On this list, I see a couple of things that we need right now, desperately, in the world, everywhere that we can put it. So climate resilience, we need to mimic the natural ecosystems that we see here, or that we would have seen here pre-colonization, pre-European colonization. Let's imagine what that looked like. What did this look like? Here's a riparian zone right over here. We're going to find woody perennials such as cottonwood, choke cherries, wild plums, currants. You're going to find a bunch of animals out here and over there, like the herd of bison, elk, all these sorts of things. With predators, pack predators like wolves, pushing those herds around, rotational grazing. We can mimic these systems. And we also want to remember that edible woody perennials, for our forestry friend, edible woody perennials have increasingly overabundant yields, and multiple crops combined have compounding yields. So how do we design a successful agroforestry system in the Southwest or anywhere on planet Earth? We need frameworks in order to ensure that we will be successful. Well, luckily, regenerative agriculture indeed provides. We have these frameworks in place. So I want to go through, this is high level. So write down your questions. I'm going to try to leave 10 minutes for questions at the end. But this is a way that anybody can approach their landscape with their goals, intentions, and values, and make decisions that will lead to the fruition of their goals in alignment with their values to create ecosystem services through agroforestry. That was a lot of words. Let's go. Let's see what we can do. Step 1, something called keyline design. Who's heard of keyline design? Great. Oh, wow. Fantastic. So keyline design is a regenerative water management and development pattern or framework. So we need to slow the water down, spread it out, and soak it in. How do we do this most effectively? Let's look at how watersheds work. When Water falls on planet Earth, it lands evenly across the surface, and then it flows downhill, right? Perpendicular to contour, 90 degrees, water's gonna find it and go downhill. We can rely on water to continue to fall. Very nice to know. When it does this, it slides off of the high ridges towards the low valleys. And if those valleys are not stabilized, that soil isn't stabilized, you cause erosion. Now, erosion is land degradation. So this is how your watersheds work, right? You got your mountain range over here, you have your ridges up here, and then you have your valleys. If you rain on this, that water will concentrate in the valleys. Keyline design provides an opportunity to hold that water high up in the landscape to preserve its gravitational potential energy. Preserve it high up in the landscape, spread it out slowly, so high in those valleys, catch it with earthworks, swales, berms, subsoiling, and then spread it slowly out towards the dry ridges. 1% slope, right? Water's gonna flow. Catch it high and slow it down so it goes out to those ridges to evenly distribute the water across as much of the ecosystem, as much of the landscape as possible. So we find the key point. Key point exists on the landscape. It's called the inflection point, where the landscape goes from concave to convex, where it goes from an erosive force to a depositional force. Right in the middle is our inflection point. Just beneath that is our key point. From the key point, we draw a key line, either a contour line or a gently sloped line with earthworks, such as these. See, you have a berm and then a swale. That water moves downhill, gets stopped by the earth, and then slowly led out towards those ridges. Those swales, those earthworks are now a perfect position to not only harvest water, but to place the roots of woody perennials to utilize that water, to hold it, to store it in itself and in the soil, to release it evenly and consistently throughout the season, no matter the differential in precipitation on a yearly basis. Okay, so we have the key line, and now we have key line cultivation patterns where we follow that key line and we can make parallel lines to create our farming systems. So as you probably recall, our agriculture is based on rectilinear patterning, right? It's a rectangle, lines up and down, nice and straight. That's how our machinery works. That's how our equipment, all the mechanization depends on our parallelism. You'll notice parallelism in our built environment as well. This is indeed parallel, and it is indeed linear. It's just curvilinear instead of rectilinear. So it is an applicable pattern to our current practices, whether that be agricultural or in the built environment. So we can do this on the landscape, but we want to make sure we're making effective management decisions. So what is an effective management decision? It is a decision that leads us closer to the fruition of our long-term goals in alignment with our core values. So the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People gives us another framework that we can use in planning these processes. So these first 3 are our planning process. These next 3 is the spirit with which we engage with each other and the ecosystem. And then the final habit is our management strategy. So we have be proactive, begin with the end in mind, put first things first. That's how we plan. And then think win-win, seek first to understand, then to be understood, and synergize. That's the spirit with which we engage. And then we sharpen the saw, we manage. I'm going to go through these and overlay them with the holistic decision-making framework. So when we're talking about making effective decisions to design an agroforestry system, we have to start with understanding what we're managing. It's very complex, right? So we start by defining the whole under management. The whole under management is the be proactive habit of the 7 habits. We are humans. One of our human endowments is we are responsible. We are able to respond to the situation. So we are the decision makers. We need to identify who's making decisions and who has veto power over a project. Then we look at the resource base. There's ecological capital, living and material, and then there's the human capital, all of our stakeholders and everything they bring to the table. And then there's the final form of capital, money, okay? Again, triple bottom line, ecology, equity, and economy. Then we need to articulate our holistic context. This is to say, begin with the end in mind. We need to know what we're going for. We need to make that good prayer, think of it, imagine a desirable future that we want to live in, and then put it out there in the future, right? And we need to wake up one morning in that future, look around, wow, this is beautiful. How did we get here? How did we get here? We need to get to that level of understanding our future vision. And that it helps to run through and articulate our holistic context. So what is our statement of purpose? Our organization, our personal mission. My personal mission is to help restore as much of the ecosystem as quickly as possible. That helps me make decisions. So that is aligned with your core values. Next, we state our quality of life statements. What does our daily life want to look like? We want to feed our people. We want to enjoy dinner around the table. We want to have time and ability and flexibility. Identify them, articulate them, write them down. Then forms of production. What do we need to produce in order to ensure our quality of life? And then we need to imagine the future of that resource base. What will that resource base need to look like in the future to ensure that future generations get to enjoy this quality of life? So this creates a North Star for us. We have begun with the end in mind. We know that we are the decision makers and we know what we're trying to create and envision in terms of our quality of lives. This decision-making framework will help us orient ourselves with the myriad of decisions that's coming our way. Soil type and tree species and layout and zoning and all that stuff. We need this first. Here are some testing questions to really figure out if this action is the right action. Donna said that she would share these slides, so I just want these in here for reference. These are great for managing complexity. Okay, so now we come to the third habit of highly effective people. Put first things first. So we want to put things in their right place and we want to put them there in the right order. Okay, luckily we have the key line scale of permanence to help us do this. This is a framework that puts the amount of energy it takes to change a phenomenon over the time it takes to change a phenomenon. You'll see climate takes a lot of energy and a lot of time to change. Then we see land shape takes quite a bit as well. And we can work our way all the way down, but we see water. Now water, we have influence over how water moves on the landscape through earthworks. Every construction project, this slab, all of it, earthworks. So we can implement and utilize those earthworks to manage our water. So that water pattern, you saw those nice curves on the landscape. That's the first step that we manage. Do we want to spread it out to the ridges? Do we want to concentrate it in the valleys? Does it come in over here in this weird part and we want it over there? Great, we can manage that water. It's flexible. Now that we know where the water goes, so this water is the highest point that we have that we can exert significant influence. Okay, this was my farm, Deer Tree Farm. This was our water management pattern that we created using swales and berms and then planting those trees. We look at the land shape to understand slope, aspect, to understand the landscape that we're working with. And again, we're going up. So water, land shape, we understand what landscape we're working on. Climate is going to tell us our design parameters. Where do we live? Oh, traditional ecological knowledge already has a lot of information about living in this climate. What species will survive here, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're going to start working our way down and we see that water, now that the water pattern is set, we can put in our infrastructure, our roads and our access and utilize those surfaces to harvest water. We now know, because our roads and access are there, where the energy lines go, where the water lines go. So we now know where we can plant our trees. This is where agroforestry fits. Agroforestry fits here very nicely. This is Cedar Springs Farm once again. We planted 8,000 trees on 40 acres. Deer Tree Farm, 8,000 trees, 4,000 trees on 8 acres. So highly intensive 3-foot center on water management earthworks. We're planting bare root trees. We're utilizing, I'll show you a picture of our tree planter here in a moment. We're utilizing bare root trees with a mechanized tree planter to just roll along, planting at 3 foot, 6 foot centers, huge amount of trees. Last year, we planted 250,000 trees in upstate New York on water management earthworks in less than a month. Scalable, efficient, effective solutions. Now we know where our structures go, and we can build them with this ecological design in mind. Again, we know where our trees are going to go, so we know where we can put our structures to address extreme heat, wind breaks, riparian buffer zones, sight and sound barriers, erosion and flood control. And then we know how to subdivide. We can use buffer zones, riparian buffer zones to create subdivision between properties and uses. And then we just get to town rebuilding the soil. This is our litmus test for regenerative agriculture. If we're rebuilding soil, it is regenerative. So here are the 6 soil health principles. And here's the possibility that we have. So how do we develop the strategic plan from everything I've just been saying? Again, we have already created our vision. We now have begun with the end in mind. So we wake up in the morning of 10 years from now and we see these beautiful trees and we see these systems and we imagine the fruition of our dream. And then we do something called backcasting. We look backwards and we take a step-by-step approach. When did I plant those trees? How did I get that business set up? Who were my partners? What led to this success? All the way back to the present moment. And now we look forward at that backcasting. We have a strategic plan. We know what step to take next. At least we have a map. We know what to follow. We're not shooting in the dark. So that's a really helpful skill is backcasting. And now we engage in this think win-win. How can what we do benefit us and the ecosystem and each other and vulnerable populations and produce money? Plus $1 means you've paid for all of your expenses and you are profitable. $1, pay for all your expenses and you made a little bit of money. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Where are we? This landscape was grazed by bison, moved by wolves, managed by megafauna, you know? The water was managed by beavers. Can we understand that and mimic that and replicate that? And then we start to synergize. And we start to jam. We start to move around. We make something good. And we take care of ourselves and what we created by sharpening the saw. So that's management over time. It's just smoothing out those rough edges and making that energy flow. So just a quick few case studies here of success. So how do we integrate agroforestry into existing agricultural systems? Well, we can implement keyline patterning on pastures. It'd be more like subsoiling and then making windbreaks around the edges for livestock. It could be redeveloping our orchards to be on this new water management pattern. Again, flexible, integrating what works for us based on our machinery and our management style, and water catchment with all of these positives going along with it. So there's Jake and Megan and June, and they are really focused on silvopasture. So they're trying to mimic those natural systems that we've been talking about. This is a ranching focus. Now, ranching in Colorado, scalable, profitable silvopasture, high profit margins through animal integration. And these meat profits have really allowed them to buy the trees, implement these systems, and carry on in the green. Okay, so they've really focused on breaking down their planting sections based on riparian areas, dry lands, and then that special space in between are the irrigated croplands and pastures. So really focusing those tree species based on those categories. And then their crop focus is a regionally adapted honey locust that they're fondly referring to as the honey badger. Highland, drought resilient, huge pods. Honey locust, those pods can be harvested, ground up, and fed to their animals all winter long. They plant a locust tree, start getting harvests in 3 to 5 years, and those harvests will only grow over time. Every time the tree grows, they get a larger and more abundant crop. It's also a nitrogen fixer, which is perfectly adapted for their pastures. They can coppice that tree and have extremely nice hardwood for their fences. Start to see all these co-benefits arising. So, and you can see these are just from the USDA, riparian zones, wind breaks, etc. This was my old farm. I sold it to a lovely family who have taken over stewardship management capacity. We really focused on hardy fruit rootstock, berry establishment, and nut crop trials. It's true chestnuts grow in Colorado. Staple carbohydrate does grow in Colorado. Hazelnuts do grow in Colorado. Staple protein and fat crop. You put those together, survival food, staple food, just saying. Now, integrated passive water catchment and gated pipe flood irrigation. So integrating these practices into existing infrastructure and systems. And I prioritized parallelism for ease of management. It was easier to mow. It was easier to move my animals around. This is a picture of our tree planter. The video won't work, so I'm not even going to try. But we have our bare root trees up here. There's a shank in the ground making a little opening. You put that tree right there, and these two wheels back here close up the seam. 1 minute, got 30 plants put in the ground. Doing that for 3 weeks, that's how you can achieve getting 250,000 trees in the ground. So now Elk Run Farm is going to talk next. So I'll just kind of go through this relatively quickly. But Drylands Agroecology Research, that's my good buddy Nick. We've been friends for a long time. That's all the water that was caught in these earthworks at this flood event recently, at this big rain event called Springtime in Colorado 2023. Incredibly high drought resilience. That's their focus. All low water species, high density and diversity planting, crop breeding. If a crop doesn't grow in Colorado, that just means you're not growing enough of that crop in Colorado. We need high populations to select for the survivability in our bioregion. Okay, subsoiling. These are the subsoiling practices along those patterns, along those water catchment patterns. You can start to allow water to infiltrate. We're not building topsoil on top of the ground. We're building it from the top down, letting the air get down there and turning the subsoil into topsoil. So functioning within Colorado, if you want to know some about water law, Colorado Water Law for Non-Lawyers is a great resource. One thing I'll say is, we can do erosion control. We can make check dams and erosion dams. We can slow it down, spread it out, soak it in. We just can't stop it. Okay, and augmentation plans, there's a no harm rule for Colorado water law. If we're going to use water, we don't want to stop it from getting to the people downstream. So you have to make an augmentation plan. Well, we can make those augmentation plans, which says we are getting our water for this project, this restoration project from over here. You can get that water through efficiency measures, buy those water rights, and create that augmentation plan to make this all totally legal. Just some food for thought, food for thought. And remember, local power over land use or land use authority is in the local sector, local government. So policy change and implementation is going to happen locally. Really important to know. So last couple of case studies, we have Restoration Agriculture Development, Inc., RAD. This is Mark Shepard. He wrote Restoration Agriculture. This is his 100-acre chestnut, hazelnut, apple, plum farm. Full in GMO corn cropland. Okay, that's Water for Any Farm, his water management book, which developed from P.A. Yeoman, who wrote the book on it, Water for Every Farm. This is Sacred Song Farm in Mancos, Colorado, focusing on pasture. This is their earthworks. Bulldozers go a long way. You move that dirt once, use those fossil fuels, that's going to be like that till the ice comes back. Okay, this is Nicaragua. They mitigated their flood and drought cycle. Huge flood events and then dry for 9 months. Store that water and use it throughout the year. Huge projects like that going on in India. Okay, this is that original book, Water for Every Farm. Kind of looks like Boulder in the Front Range a little bit. This is Australia. This was designed for drought tolerance, drought resistance. Ridgedale permaculture, they're at 60 degrees north in Sweden. Okay, so the flexibility of this, silvopasture, windbreaks, and then integrating agroforestry into the built environment. So all of these patterns, slow it down, spread it out, soak it in. This can all be applied in the built environment to those undevelopable pieces of land, to those clover leaves on the highway, to our medians and to our buffer zones in our built environment itself. This can be applied in all of these spaces highly effectively. The thing we have to watch out for is green gentrification. Okay, we plant these things and then the low income vulnerable populations get outcompeted by the raising real estate costs. Now they're kicked out. They don't get to enjoy any of those benefits. So how do we mitigate that? Stakeholder engagement at the beginning. Lead with equity. That's our only way that we can really combat that. So just in conclusion, I just want to reiterate that agroforestry in the Southwest is flexible, is effective, is scalable, is efficient, and it is a climate resilient solution for regenerative land use and development in general. For agriculture to the built environment, we have frameworks, we have solutions to implement these things now. We don't need to do any more research to see how much carbon it sequesters. We need to get the roots in the ground. We can do that research later. So thank you all very much. I'm ready for questions whenever you are. That was a whirlwind. Yeah. Extremely nice to be straight into grass. That sod just, thank you. So she was asking about, in this picture we have, we're planting straight into grass with our the tree transplanter mechanism. And she's wondering if we had to do any mitigation or if there's any problems there. And that sod just opens up like a zipper and then just closes back up. So there's not, all you gotta do is walk behind and make sure it's straight and get the air out of the ground. So it's really, really nice. And so, we were talking earlier about having a nice grassed field. It's like, that's ideal. It's like all that absorption is already happening. And then over time, we can just replace those species into what you want. But it's, every site has a different management style. So maybe that just means there's more mowing, whereas on a dirt lot, there'd be more weed suppression. So it's just a management consideration, but that works great. Any other questions? Man, I blew y'all mind. You don't have any questions. All right, go ahead. Yes.
Is it going to be created by a different set of tools or mechanisms than if you have drop off and things like that? Like, what practically, how do I do that?
It's a great question. So the most important thing is to repeat the question. So the question is, with these keyline patterns, what are the different considerations if you have a very small, gentle slope on flatlands, or if you're working with a site like this where there's really steep slopes? How do we install these kinds of systems or use these kinds of patterns? So you have a swale and a berm tool. That's one of our tools. Another tool is subsoiling, where you actually make that rip underground and that water falls into those rips. What's most important here is the pattern itself, because you don't have to do any earthworks necessarily if you have the right conditions to foster establishment of those trees. So it really just depends on, again, what are your goals? What's your vision? What are you trying to achieve? But swales and berms is one option. Another option is subsoiling with flood irrigation. Another option is just to make those boomerang swales, where that's a berm and swale up this way and you plant one tree and that water gets caught that way. So any way that you want to achieve that goal, what's important is the patterning itself. Because if we were to just put those trees in the ground, with that implement, you rip that soil, you put the roots in, the roots are going to follow the path of least resistance. They're going to fill in that rip. Now we have a water catchment net made of roots. And when those grow, they pump a bunch of air into the soil, they'll raise the soil up, and that'll be your earthworks. So there's a lot of flexibility there, but that patterning is what's important.
And I know you already discussed it, creating pattern. This is the first step that you were just talking about when you're looking at your land and you're figuring out which way the wind's coming from and where's the erosion happening, and so do you what do you do? Is it a land survey and just observation and taking really good notes, and you kind of sketch out the design, or hire someone else to do that for you? Or
You certainly can, so the question is, do you hire this process of design out? Or are you just taking observations around the land and then sketching it out yourself? Yes. My friends, we design these systems and we joke all the time with our clients, like, you could do this. You can do this, just follow these patterns. We're just going to do it fast, but anyone can do this. The trick is first observing and then going through that holistic decision-making framework, building that out so that when you come to this decision of, okay, which way do we want the water to go? You know what you're trying to produce. You know what quality of life you're coming from. Do we want this pattern to be really hard to access, or we want it right out our door? We can design for that. So really it's a whole systems design, but these patterns can be leveraged and implemented where they are most effective and useful for you on your particular project. And so that's why I emphasize that decision-making framework, because that's actually going to help you guide those decisions. But then when you go through these patterns, you can see, like, I can lead the water wherever I want, right? You have contour line, that is, water is going to stay there. We can send that water this way by tilting it 1% that way, or we can send it this way. And that's a decision that we can make. Yes.
That was a good question. Made me think, what if your property is above any inflection point?
What if your property is above any inflection point? My property, the water came in at the highest point of the property because it was irrigation. So that was my key point. So where is your water either? If you have a steep slope, then you find the lowest, what's the highest point that you can draw that line, right? So a lot of times when we're up here in the steep areas and the property line is right there, maybe we just go down to the bottom and draw our line there for flood control or catchment of that excess water runoff. Or say we go up all the way to the top and we just catch as much before it gets too steep. We just make that water catchment up there and recharge the aquifer that way. So again, it's really context specific, but possible. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And so if you can create that pattern up high and then find other ways of replicating it on the way down, that might be a solution for you. No. Yes. Yes, those terraces, right. So just talking about if we don't have an inflection point, or if it's super steep, we can start up higher, Okay, there was another, yes.
Curious, you showed pictures of the tree planting along the berm key line for the 3 different farms. I'm just curious, what were the survival rates of those trees, and what kinds of management practices did you have to do to help ensure survival?
Great question. So survival rating on these kinds of systems is anywhere from 50 to 80%, which is why we have such intensive plantings, and which is also why we use these small sapling whips, bare root trees, because these suckers cost me 87 cents a piece. If we're going to put in a 1.5 inch caliper tree, it's $250. That's not even renting an auger. So that's why we put in all of this intensive 3 to 6 foot spacing, 3 foot for shrubs, 6 foot for canopy trees. We might get 50. I planted 4,000 trees on this 8 acre. We had 60% surviving. So that's over 2,000 trees have survived on that acreage. In upstate New York, in the Catskills, we planted 250,000 trees. We might get a 70% survival rating. That's a pretty good amount of trees right there. So the sheer quantity of carbohydrates being dumped into the ecosystem. So that's where that intensive planting really comes in handy. And it depends. Once a tree is established, 3 years to establish, after that point, they're established. If they're going to die, there's nothing you can do about it. So just getting them to establishment. So in the Southwest here, that might be putting your drip line in for the first 3 years, just so that they can get established. The earthworks, so we have a nice wet year like this. We have a nice wet year and we have trees sitting in water. They just got planted. So those have a really high chance of being established. that's where that rainwater precipitation catchment comes in handy too.
So I manage this multi-state innovation research where we encourage farmers, small businesses, ideas, innovative ideas that could be commercialized, that could be patented and commercialized for adoption and use by farmers. From your presentation, what do you think is an innovation that you will develop and commercialize?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, these this keyline design has. Thank you for reminding me. What patterns? What do we see as an innovation here that can be commercialized and really like put into scale? Yeah, what's scalable? You know, I'm wary of patents because I want this to go everywhere. I don't want anybody to have a hold of it. You can't do that without paying me. No, I want this everywhere, anywhere. So keyline design is major. That's a major way of managing our water asset, our water resource. Crops can survive with all sorts of nutrient deficiencies. The one nutrient it cannot be deficient in is water. So we have to manage our water resource. And this pattern allows us to do that regeneratively and effectively. So if I were to just, you know, if we were to go out to flatlands in Kansas with GMO crops, I would recommend this water management pattern. They don't even have to stop rectilinear farming. Just rip that, subsoil it on that pattern, and you would have marked improvements and benefits. So that in and of itself is a huge asset, keyline design. Secondarily would be the holistic decision-making framework. You know, how to make effective decisions, you know, to ensure that we are regenerating. And the scale of permanence is helpful insofar as if we're going to build a new development or you know, rather than sprawl that is damaging our ecosystem, what if development itself was helping restore the ecosystem, helping to create ecosystem services? So that's really keyline design, holistic management, and the scale of permanence are very helpful. Donna, thank you. Your tree farm, it was 11 inches of rain, annual precipitation. We had irrigation rights. So that really helped us. That's why we had 75% establishment rating, survival rating. If I didn't, it'd probably been 50. You know, we lived in what's called the donut hole. I call it the donut hole. Water goes over there and over there and over there, but not right here. So we were really dependent on that irrigation. But, you know, 11 inches of rain, if we had captured every inch of that, and then we would have been okay, you know, and we did a lot of it. 11 inches of rain is enough rain to is more water than the entire municipality of Boulder County uses. Just saying, you know, so just as a point of fact of how much water that really is, if we capture it, if we catch it. But establishment's very, very difficult without consistent watering. So.
Trees that you are, like the honey locust example, was it mostly for fodder or other?
Yes.
Yeah. What's it got producing pods and
so once you got producing pods and we harvest those pods and save them for winter and utilize them for animal feed, then we can, because of that close plantings, plant spacing, we can thin those trees and do coppicing. We can coppice them. So every 3 feet, we thin it down to every 6 feet. And then we can use that for either animal fodder or for lumber, timber, firewood, and whatever we want. And then all the benefits from those coppice legumes will go into the soil. There's a number of different ways. Okay, how did we thank you? How did we harvest the pods? The first question that I just answered, I forget about, but was thinning and managing those honey locusts. And then how do we manage, how do we harvest those pods? Right now it's by hand and it's pretty inefficient. A really helpful tool would be like a tree shaker, like the cherry industry uses. Just go in there, grab a hold, drop it all onto a tarp and then scoop it into a bin. So that would be a highly mechanized, scalable, efficient means of doing that. You know, there's all sorts of cool equipment to do this stuff. Yes.
Jay, quick question. So I'm still framing in my head, but I'll just spit it out what I have.
Great.
So thinking about if you're talking to someone who wants to convert one of these systems,
Yeah.
I love this framework. I think this would be a great idea for my land. But they have to be profitability minded, right?
Yes.
They've got a family to care for, they're a member of the community,
Yep.
all that.
That's
So
right.
if you got, what would you say to a producer who they're like, 70% sounds like a great success rating, but that's still my dollar bills that have to go into that.
Yeah.
And if this species of chestnut is highly valuable in the Midwest and the East, but if I'm not sure chestnut's going to establish, what is the, I guess, that path forward for a family or for an organization that needs to be profit motivated as well as ecologically and socially motivated to plant in that density, recognizing that maybe they get a 50% failure and they're going to have to then replant, especially if there's not a great regionally adapted variety and they're not the ones who are trying to be plant breeders.
So really thinking about how to be profitable minded when designing these systems, right, is what you're saying. So how do we design the system?
And motivate people recognizing that they do need to be profitable.
We need to be profitable. We need to be profitable and might not have the capital or resources to make those crop selection investments at the beginning. So how do we design these systems with that idea of profitability and motivation at the beginning is what you're asking.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Just trying to say it and also repeat it at the same time. So that's where the holistic decision-making framework comes really in handy. You want to know what your quality of life is. And those statements will start generating numbers. Oh, I want to have this quality of life. How much do I have to profit in order to achieve that? That'll start giving you numbers. And once you have those numbers, you can backcast from there to look at what the viable profit margin industries are. So market gardening, not a high profit margin enterprise, highly intensive, lots of input, not a lot of profit margin. Fruit, I raised 1,000 peach trees. Great crop, awesome, not super large profit margin. Animals do have a larger profit margin. My highest profit margin was with my pasture raised chickens and turkeys. So when designing my system, thinking about, okay, how can I repay my investment as soon as possible while it's coming in? And how do I take care of it in a good way so that it establishes and survives while making money? So you look at whatever enterprise you're already making money at, look at whatever enterprise you already have the highest profit margins in, and then integrate that into your system and center your business model on that enterprise and build it out from there. So Jake at Cedar Springs, he's a cattleman. That's what he does. And his profit margins are great. And so he's able to use that business to buy the trees that will eventually enhance that business. You know, the trees he selected were for cows and pigs, and he raises cows and pigs. And so that silvopasture model has really started with that profit mindedness and that vision of the future that he wants to live. And then he worked back from there and integrated that wholeheartedly into the design of his system itself. So that is, I think that's really important. Part of the holistic decision-making framework is you have a document at the end. And part of that document within who are the decision makers, the resource base and the money, you have a financial plan, you have a business plan baked into it before you even put the roots in the ground. That's what I would recommend. Yeah. I think I'm probably out of time, right, Donna? All right. Well, I just want to say thank you once again, everybody, for listening.
Next up, we have Amy Jane Wolf, who is the Director of Research at the Drylands Agroecology.
Hot mic.
Put this to myself.
You can put it in your body. You can even set it on the chair.
Well, that's
This
all
picture
right.
is always talking that direction.
I'm not gonna remember that. Let me put it on. Is that gonna be weird? Does that work?
Soon enough, if it's not,
Okay,
some of the folks at home, so.
okay, amazing. Will you give me a Amy, can you give me a 5-minute warning? Because I'm gonna try and look, but I might forget. For my time. Okay, thank you. Are we good to go? I think we're good. Okay, all right. Well, really happy to be here today. My name's Amy. I'm with Drylands Agroecology Research. Super happy to go after AJ because he kind of framed a lot of the work that we do really well. I will say I actually first came into this world through studying anthropology at college. I was fascinated by the human story, and I really left that degree feeling like I wanted to go be a hunter-gatherer. I don't think that was what my mom hoped when she sent me to college. I thought that would probably be pretty impractical, so I started farming, fell in love with the lifestyle, did it for years. Even the organic vegetable farming I was doing was not feeling right in my gut, and I couldn't quite place why at the moment. But I think what I was feeling is this still doesn't look like nature. This still doesn't look like a natural ecosystem to me. Kind of set me on this journey into the world of permaculture. I did a number of things. It wasn't until I stumbled across Elk Run Farm that I felt for the first time, wow, this is actually a living example of what I've kind of been craving and feeling intuitively can be true. So here to just share a little bit of that story and the work that that's grown into, which is the nonprofit. But I know some of you are familiar with these lovely humans, Nick and Marissa. They started this project. But basically, this all began in 2015 when Nick DiDomenico set out to farm. He had spent a lot of time in South America, was deeply influenced by the indigenous communities he lived with there, wanted to farm. His family managed to get a hold of this 15-acre piece of land up near Lyons, was totally degraded. Nobody ever thought to take a before picture. We really regret that now. But you imagine this landscape with not a scrap of vegetation on it. It's baked, it's eroding. On the property, there was a well that could irrigate less than 1 acre of that 15-acre property. He actually reached out to a number of people for advice on where to start to farm here, and their advice pretty much universally was find another piece of land. There is no way you're going to be able to farm on this. So it became this living experiment in how do we actually regenerate really deeply degraded land when there isn't water available to do it. And I know that this is probably preaching to the choir a little bit, but I think water is just something we think about with climate change often as a consequence. What we really realize is water is the limiting factor in these dry climates for as much as our landscape can produce, the carbon it can sequester, the biodiversity it can support. And losing water from landscapes is driving climate change. It's not just a consequence of climate change. This picture is actually one of our partner properties and such a potent example of this cycle of desertification. Once the vegetation goes, it dries out, really hard to flip that cycle going the other way. And so really the work our nonprofit does is based in a lot of what AJ described, but how do we plant the water before we think about planting plants? How do we rehydrate landscapes when there isn't irrigation available? And the technique that we're largely using to do that is what's called a contour swale. And this goes along with the keyline design strategy we're describing. But if you imagine, even on a gently sloped landscape, water really has a tendency to run off and take soil with it. You're finding the level contour line on that slope and you're digging a basin and a berm system. So as water comes down, it hits that basin, deeply infiltrates. If you did nothing else, the effect on landscapes of that is actually pretty profound. A couple of years after Nick and Marissa dug the first swales at Elk Run Farm, they had a soil scientist come out. And he had been working mostly in conventional ag systems. It was a really dry drought year. Everything was drying up. He took this soil water probe and he put it just under where the swale was on the landscape. And he pushed it down and it was dry and it was dry and suddenly it was wet. And you could almost see the point that the water had infiltrated. And he was almost in tears. He's like, I haven't seen this. And so that's a piece of what we're doing. First is just rehydrating the land. That's a picture from above. I should have borrowed AJ's, it was better quality of what that system looks like. But our next question is, in the basin of that swale, how can we make it retain as much water as possible? And part of that story is compost and mulch that's going to act like a sponge and a battery over winter to get all of that moisture in the swale before we plant in spring. What we experimented with last year for the first time is actually layering a native oyster mushroom mycelium between those two layers. And the effect already has been unbelievable. Within just winter, before even the spring deluge of rain, there was that web of white mycelial netting all throughout those swales. And the person we got this from, Zach, who runs Boulder Mushroom, has done some initial studies that suggest 2 to 3 times the retention rate of water in the soil underneath pre-inoculated mulch. So we're curious to see. But in this initial experiment at Elk Run Farm, over this 10-acre pasture, they dug these contour swales, they filled them with only mulch, that's all budget would allow, and then they planted about 1,000 trees, knowing that they would never be able to irrigate them after the day they were planted. People thought they were a little nuts, even though they're $1 investment each, that's a lot of trees. They also expected most of them to die, so they planted them 1.5 feet apart. 4 years later, last fall, we're tracking a 79% survival rate on those trees, completely dry land. So this was surprising even to Nick and Marissa, and really became this question, like, we actually can establish dry land agroforestry systems in this climate. And just to give you an idea of some of the species that are being planted and the numbers of them that were present, kind of like I think Creighton was talking about earlier, apples and pears dominate many of the systems we put in simply because they have the highest potential for yield of food. But we're experimenting with a wide range of species that are both traditional fruit plants and native fruit plants. And most importantly, every single fruit is interplanted with a nitrogen fixing nurse plant. If any of you are plant nerds, happy to get into that more later. But basically the pathway at Elk Run they chose was between those contour swales, they're practicing this holistic grazing. How many of you are familiar with Alan Savory and his work? Quite a few. So basically, in a really brief nutshell, for those who aren't, Alan Savory was kind of the one who pioneered how can you use animals to actually regenerate grasslands instead of degrade them. He was working in the grasslands of Southern Africa. And this question kind of came up for him at watching his own work, is why are these high numbers of animals living healthily on grassland ecosystems here while cattle are turning them into desert? And he realized there was something missing in our domestic animal systems. What was that? Predators, right? A way to keep those animals bunched up close together and moving across the landscape. So basically, by copying that pattern of wild animals on grasslands, they were able to regenerate the grasslands at Elk Run really effectively, just using electric fencing to keep the movements contained and thoughtful. And so just to share one other case study from this farm that we're working at, when Nick got to that property in the early years, he wanted to start farming, hadn't gotten into it. He'd heard pigs degrade land. On his land, there was a piece of ground that had been used as a parking lot for years and years. It had gravel road base on it. He thought, you know, this can't possibly get any worse, so I think I'm going to put the pigs there. Started throwing in mulch, manure, wood chips, watched as the pigs started actually turning that into the ground. After a couple of years of that, topsoil was forming. So he went to Massa Seed Foundation. For those who aren't aware, it's a bioregional saving seed bank in this area. Asked them for their most drought resilient staple crop seed, corn, beans, amaranth, planted it, terrible yield the first year, but they saved the seed from that. So year after year, what's now happened on that piece is that they've basically done crop, pigs, chickens, crop, pig, chickens. The pigs knock over all the crops and turn them into the ground. The chickens fertilize, scratch through, they let it sit, they plant. What now is growing in that field looks like this. And that's pretty amazing given that after usually about late June, the well runs too dry to irrigate that. So it's dry land for most of summer, really high yields using this integrated crop and livestock management. And seed saving in tandem. So basically, this is kind of this approach that we're looking at from Elk Run Farm. This worked really well. What we're considering it really is ecosystem development. This idea of how do we actually create a new type of ecosystem that meets human needs, but functions like a wild ecosystem. And I know myself, when I share this story, a lot of the pushback that first comes up for people is, oh, but you're not planting all natives. Does this belong here? And to me, it's this interesting question of like, do this many people belong here? My understanding is that the carrying capacity or number of people living in the Front Range belt was about 2,000 pre-settlement. When we think about how many people we have here now, even a fraction of that, we have to be able to create new types of ecosystems and see ourselves again as a keystone species that changes our environment, but creates opportunity by doing that. So that's kind of the way that we see this work. And if our systems are actually thriving and functioning like they should function like a natural ecosystem. That's our goal. Our whole research program is really geared around asking that. I think someone mentioned ecosystem services earlier, same word for, does it function like a wild ecosystem? There are so many things we could look at to answer that question, but the three that really came up for us as the critical ones is how well does it retain moisture, sequester carbon, and support biodiversity. So everything that we're studying are metrics that basically correlate with all of that. Don't need to get into this in extreme detail unless people have an interest in those things, then we can. But I will say, as somebody who also teaches permaculture and has a permaculture-based homestead, this to me feels like the permaculture principle observe and interact. And it gives us a really clear structure to do that. I am not a scientist. I've always thought it's really ironic that I ended up running our research program for that reason. But having a structured way to spend time literally on your hands and knees looking at bugs on your land gives you a whole different lens into what's going on there. So a really vital piece of what we're doing for the land managers. And just out of that program, a couple of things that we're noticing in the past few years. The organic matter percentages have increased about 280% in the dryland pastures. That's more like 960% in the grain fields. So we're seeing huge water absorption potential. Likewise, in the pastures, the fertility, the nitrogen, fertility is a big question. Nitrogen is simple. The nitrogen levels in soil have increased by over 1,400%. And as I said before, on that pilot farm, we're experiencing about a 79% survival rate of the trees and shrubs. We have this vision in Boulder County of hitting 1,000 acres within the next 7 years under management of systems like these. Part of the reason we want to do that is because we are keen to restore that much land. Part of the reason we want to do it is to understand what is actually the potential of these systems on a large scale to shift the microclimate of that area, to actually impact the ecology of Boulder County. But I think what we realize even more is that the way this is truly going to spread is by actually creating pathways for people who want to do this work to step into it. And as somebody who myself has had a lot of land access issues in the past, I think one of the big questions around that is so much momentum from young aspiring land stewards right now, really hard to get land to actually grow into using it with, and resources and mentorship. So we're designing and starting a training program right now to help bridge those pathways. But really the way we're approaching this is by taking on land partners. So if any of you come tomorrow to the tour, we'll be going to Yellow Barn Farm, which is the scaled demonstration site for our work. It's 100 acres. But we are basically partnering with all of these private landowners who want this to happen on their land. And in a perfect world, we're doing the design with them so that they can actually go on to manage the systems well. And we're researching on these sites. So we have 5 land partners to date. We've planted 12,000 trees in similar systems across all of them. And I'll just give a brief profile of them. How are we doing on time? Oh, plenty of time. Good. I'm talking fast. I'm not going to go into Yellow Barn Farm too much because many of you will see it tomorrow. But basically, we just put in this spring about 5,000 trees in the dryland 50-acre pasture above the ditch here. Unlike maybe AJ's model, we live in Boulder County and we have a lot of humans in Boulder County who are excited about this work. So all of our tree planting to date has been highly volunteer driven. We had about 600 people out helping plant trees this spring. In our context, that's really exciting to us because it's a chance for people to engage and see these systems up close. But here's a picture of one of our tree plantings. Our biggest tree planting happened on that really unexpectedly cold Saturday when it was about 36 degrees out, a thin layer of snow on the ground. We're like, no one's gonna come. We had 350 people show up anyway, so it was a big spring. Metacarbon Farm is right across the street from us, and they're a for-profit, mostly vegetable farm. So really excited to explore how do these models actually integrate with people who are already farming for profit. This spring, we put in our first production orchard, and this is one of the only systems we've put in that is actually irrigated. But what we're excited about is to create a really diverse orchard so that instead of just having a whole block of one thing, we're trialing a bunch of both varieties and selections of each fruit, but also a lot of diversity and interplanting for disease pressure. The Britain goat dairy we're really excited about. This is the picture I showed you earlier that basically that entire ground is devegetated, or was before we started the project. So this is a really cool way of looking at a site that actually has very, very sandy soil that's blown in on top of a clay hardpan. And again, will be completely dry land. And we're really excited to notice already just how much these swales are pooling and showing soil life, an abundance of macroorganisms in it just after a winter of sitting. But we planted 1,500 trees there this spring as well. And then this is a really interesting application. How many of you have gotten to visit an agrivoltaic site? Few people. So in a nutshell, agrivoltaics is basically combining agriculture and solar panels. And early when I started for DAR, I was actually talking to CSU about engaging with them around research for what we were doing. And he's like, oh, it's the same as agrivoltaics. And I was like, what do you mean it's the same as agrivoltaics? We don't have any solar panels. And he was like, yeah, instead of using the actual surface of the solar panel as your catchment, you're using the hill. So it's the same idea of concentrating water in a landscape to one spot and then creating this shadier microclimate that rehydrates the land, which in our case is done with trees, but in agrivoltaics is done with solar panels. So it's kind of an interesting thing where obviously a solar panel does not fulfill the same function as a tree, but it's this idea of how do we actually use the microclimate and water catchment created by solar panels to rehydrate landscapes. And so we actually, the Nature Conservancy funded this project, and it was a collaboration with Jack's Solar Garden, if any of you know that, as well as the BHP housing community that owns the arrays. But this is a completely dryland solar array, unbelievably degraded, really fast draining soil. After they put it in, it gets compacted like most of them do, devegetated, nothing is done to restore it. What we did last fall is basically dug contour swale basins underneath the panels. And because the landscape was not on contour, they basically spill into one another. And so they're going to basically catch all of the water that flows off of those panels in the basin. We put mycelium, we put biochar, we put compost, we put mulch. Then we planted about 1,000 perennial plants. So the goal here is to see, is it possible that those perennial plants can actually thrive? One, for restoration purposes, but two, they're mostly medicinal. And the goal in a way is to actually see, is it feasible to grow medicinal crops at scale underneath established solar panels that already exist and have that be enough profit that it justifies doing this. So one of the more interesting projects we've been involved with. And then I also just want to mention this piece that's a lot more complicated, but when Nick and Marissa started this project, their goal really wasn't land regeneration. It was finding a new way to live in relationship to land. That's what they wanted to do. And that is a really complicated thing. That's culture shift. And that's a really hard thing to actually describe how to scale. But what we realize is systems aren't disconnected. And while land regeneration is critical, there's this piece of economic systems, cultural systems, social systems, all interweaving. And that's really what we're excited about, is that new way of being, and also recognizing how much that is, as many people in this room have said, the way humans used to relate to land for most of human history, and many still do. So we're re-remembering how to live that way. And we're also trying to do it in a way that partners with Indigenous communities. So we've worked with Spirit of the Sun a little bit. We've worked with Harvest of All First Nations, all trying to figure out how do we create pathways forward. And we don't have those answers, but that's really central to what we're doing. Cool. So that's our team, some of it. And I think we can actually go ahead and shift into questions here, if anyone has any. Yeah.
Curious to know a little more about the relationship between Elk Run Farm and DAR, like how that evolved. And
Yeah.
what exactly, what's the scope of the research you're doing on their farm?
Yeah, definitely. So Elk Run Farm. Oh yeah, thank you. Repeat the question. Got it. The question was basically, what's the relationship between Elk Run Farm and the nonprofit, and what does that look like? Elk Run Farm, we consider now the demonstration site for the nonprofit. So that was the first place that was kind of proof of concept. The nonprofit is now an umbrella of which Elk Run is a part, but so are all of the different programs we run and land partners that we work with. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and then,
Okay.
I mean, are you, the research you're doing like,
Where are we doing it?
well, what's the scope of the research you're doing on Elk Run Farm? Are you studying every aspect of what they're doing?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll flip back to those research. So we're actually at this point, our research program is,
Oh, sorry, yes, you did.
no, that's great, but I didn't explain how it relates to the properties. And so the question was basically what research we're doing at Elk Run Farm and how and where and in what places. So right now we're looking at Yellow Barn Farm, Elk Run Farm, the Britain, actually all of the case studies I listed we're researching. And what we're really looking at is, one, we're looking at pastures, what's going on in the grassland systems. We're looking at what's happening in the swale basin itself. And then we're also looking at for example, the grain fields. And if any of you have been to Elk Run Farm, there's also a really spectacular forest garden and other elements of that system. But because we're not necessarily trying to scale those in partnership with people, we're studying them less. But we're looking at the interplay of all of these things in all of that area. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we do. So we have right. Oh, thank you. The question was if our research is available or published. So right now on our website, we have our 2022 research report is posted as a PDF, which is basically an overview of everything that we've found. We also really like to engage the public through the research. So all of the research we do is posted as volunteer days, so people can come and participate with us. I think the goal in the long run is to connect more with CSU and some other research-based institutions. I was actually talking over lunch with some folks about this, about how complex it is to study ecosystems, because a lot of what we've gotten when we've actually reached out to CSU is this like, oh, but you need to isolate this variable. Like, was it the fruit tree or the swale, or like what element that you put in made that happen? And we're kind of like, it was the interplay of all the elements, and that's what we care about. So I think with time, our hope is to actually connect more with CSU. We have a new research manager who's at CSU as a student. And I'm hoping that that will carry it further. But at the moment, basically the website. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just talking about the progression from what it used to be out running and what's able to grow now. But how much coppicing and cutback are you doing, especially with the nitrogen purpose?
Yeah.
I'm really curious about that. I don't see a lot of good data on when and how to do it, and when we actually flushing the nitrogen out and making it available. I don't know if you guys are working with that.
Yeah. Really good question. We haven't gotten to the point. Oh, thanks. It's amazing how hard that is to remember. The question was basically about the coppicing that we're doing with the nitrogen fixers in the broad scale systems. At this moment, those systems haven't developed enough to where it's actually appropriate to coppice yet. I know that in the forest garden part of Elk Run, which is irrigated and therefore a lot more developed, Nick does do a fair amount of coppicing, but that's on a much smaller scale. So we'll see how that unfolds as we go. It's a good question. And it's also one of those, a foot and a half apart and mostly alive. Are you going to cut those out? Like, what are you going to do as they mature? We still expect a lot of them to die. And we actually, in a way, are happy about that. Many of you are probably familiar with Mark Shepard's stun technique, sheer total utter neglect. As a technique for putting plants in place, not babying them at all. And then the ones that survive were meant to be there. Then we actually have a bioregionally adapted stock we can propagate from. At a point though, if those plants do all continue to survive and get large enough, we will probably cut some out for either wood or just chop and drop or whatever we need at that moment. Yeah. Yeah. Yep, that's okay. Yeah. Yeah, so a couple of answers to that. First, spirit of the, oh my gosh, okay. The question was just to speak a little bit more to our relationship with Spirit of the Sun and how working with Indigenous communities has unfolded for us. Is that accurate? Yeah, so to speak directly to Spirit of the Sun, last year, we, in partnership with Harvest of All First Nations, this was an Indigenous foods garden that we kind of created at Yellow Barn Farm in partnership. Spirit of the Sun gave a lot of seed towards that effort that we then gave back. So in the spirit of creating bioregional seed, also CSA shares from Elk Run Farm go to Indigenous elders through Spirit of the Sun. Harvest of All First Nations were definitely our greater collaborators last year. And really what we're hearing from them is the need for the creation of land access for people who no longer have the access to their traditional lands and space to be on it. So this garden was kind of a response to that. Their community was able to receive stipends to come and work in the garden throughout the year. And then they had a corn festival at Yellow Barn Farm that they ran that kind of celebrated both the garden and their Indigenous knowledge and landways. So that's kind of what the relationship has looked like to date. We are really curious to keep exploring. I think we're actively figuring out what do the pathways to healing forward look like, because there's so much trauma. And we genuinely feel that we can't actually heal our relationship to the land without healing our relationship with Indigenous peoples who are on that land. What do those ways forward look like? We're in conversation. We're trying to understand that ourselves too. But I think what also resonates really deeply for us is the fact that it's not just about, what am I trying to say? We're trying to create a new culture for everybody, a way of actually living in relationship to the land that's so much Indigenous culture embodied, but we can't focus on just one person or another to do that. We're trying to collectively do that and have a new way forward that's land-based. So we see a large piece of that cultural advocacy work that Marissa in particular spearheads as that creation of a new culture moving forward that is healing, hopefully, for all people. Yeah, and I mean, this is kind of an interesting oh my gosh. The second part of that question was, can you actually clarify more deeply? You're talking the traditional farming community. You're wondering about. Mm-hmm. So you're wondering like, how are we shifting that culture when we're relating to people who want to work with us? Is that? Sorry if I'm not understanding you fully. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. How do we shift culture through this and where we are at? Yeah, with our, I mean, at this moment, I feel like the sites that we have are a demonstration of what's possible. And mostly people who become our land partners have come and seen those. And that's why they're reaching out to us, is because they feel and see that and they want a piece of that. I don't think we've gotten to a point yet of trying to actively go out and seek partnerships with people who maybe aren't craving that shift already. And so that's easier in a way. And I know myself, like I've shifted a lot working with DAR just by being in that ecosystem day to day. So that organic relational way of shifting really is more powerful, I think, than anything else. But we have seen a huge influx of people wanting a different way of being in this community. And so I think we aren't in a way yet having to face, how do we relate to people who aren't wanting that? So. Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think that's a growth for us too, because so far, I mean, we call this research because we are unsure what fruit yields we're even going to get out of these systems. The first wild plums fruited last year, which was tremendously exciting, but they're young. In 10 years, we might know what the profit potential of the systems are. What we're almost looking at is more, what are the land regeneration benefits of these systems, and then understanding with time the profit. And most of the people we're working with are more interested in that than for-profit farms at this moment, though we're really excited to get into that with time, as we can help people predict what to expect from the investment too. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some of the species that we're interested in using medicinally in the systems? And really the solar project has been the first one that we're trialing that. We put a lot of different species in just to see what was going to work. But for example, some things that maybe we're all familiar with, like fennel, lovage, even rhubarb, which is more culinary. We also shifted into a lot of the native medicinals. I'm trying to think of all the examples, things like the orange milkweed, the Asclepias tuberosa. Catherine from Wish Garden Herbs was our consultant on that. So we basically came with the list of what are the things that we're harvesting aerial parts of as opposed to roots, because that's more feasible, that might just be drought tolerant enough to thrive in a system like this. Also some more like Navajo tea plant that maybe have less mainstream usage right now, but just to explore on that scale what's possible. Echinacea, of course, the prairie dogs ate that one pretty quick. Valerian probably would be a good one if we were going to dig up the roots, but yeah. So a number of them. Cool. Is that it? Great. I talk too fast.
I didn't know if everybody else would be interested, but you kind of answered it. I have landowners that are questioning ways to divide into the future with the mono crops that they have. It's all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that culture. I guess where I live, you know, when we started,
Mm-hmm.
surprised when the NRCS had workshops that the the people that you would think were in this, there. And it was always the mavericks, the people that were willing to try stuff that were different.